Do you remember those monsters, Ruby, Frankie, and Girardier? Well, there's this whole other fucked up side to that saga that we need to talk about. And if you're completely unfamiliar, I'll link to the previous coverage, but to give you a very top level recap, is that Ruby, who's best known for the Family Channel 8 Passengers, was sentenced to 4 to 30 years in prison for child abuse earlier this year, with Jody, a life coach and Ruby's business partner, also receiving the same sentence. Right, and the two women had initially been arrested several months earlier after 2 of Frankie's children were found trapped in horrible conditions in Hildebrandt's home. And since then, a ton more details have come out about the case, but many of them so horrific and despicable, I can't even talk about them on YouTube without this video getting suppressed. Now, Ruby, for her part, she has repeatedly blamed Jody for her actions, arguing that it was Jody who led her down this path of darkness and did so by isolating her from her family and friends. Now, of course, that's likely just an attempt to shift accountability from her own actions, but those allegations are super relevant to what we're talking about today. And that's because ProPublica and the Salt Lake Tribune recently released a wild deep dive into the totally unregulated life coaching industry that allowed Jody Hildebrandt and others like her to perpetrate this kind of abuse, often without justice. And the impacts here, they go way beyond just Hildebrandt. We're talking about a nationwide issue, with ProPublica explaining life coaches aren't therapists and are mostly unregulated across the United States. They aren't required to be trained in ethical boundaries the way therapists are, and there's no universally accepted certification for those who work in the industry. You know, part of the reason there are no regulations is because there really isn't a set definition of what a life coach is, right? They can offer services to help people lose weight, organize their money or business, change how they parent, or improve various aspects of their lives, right? And the list just goes on, and pretty much anyone can be a life coach. Now, one thing I want to make super clear here right off the bat is that in no way am I trying to say that all life coaches are bad people or that life coaching is ineffective. Or there are plenty of life coaches who run good, clean businesses, and there are many examples of people who have been helped by them. But every industry has bad folks, and we're specifically talking about one that is totally unregulated, one that relies on the business of people who are often already vulnerable. So there's just so much room to take advantage of people and for abuse to flourish. And that potential for abuse is especially concerning given how much this industry has grown in recent years, right in the aftermath of the pandemic. But the International Coaching Federation estimating that the number of coaches increased 54% from 2019 to 2022. And what's more is that the industry has become insanely lucrative, with the association also calculating that life coaches generated $4.6 billion in revenue just in 2022 alone. So you have this dangerous combination of an unregulated industry that almost anybody can join without a degree or a certificate and still make a ton of money. When I say basically anyone can join, I mean basically anyone. Or for example, in Utah, where Hildebrandt worked as a life coach, ProPublica found numerous instances of therapists who lost their licenses for misconduct and were deemed unsafe to work with patients, but they were still able to keep working the mental health field by turning to life coach. And records from Utah's Division of Professional Licensing, DOPL, showed that since 2010, at least 43 mental health professionals in the state had surrendered their licenses or had them revoked, denied, or expired on suspension. But then searches on LinkedIn of profiles and business websites had indicated that a third of those people have continued working in the mental health field as mental health associates, motivational speakers, and life coaches. And that's even more worrisome given the fact that some of these people lost their licenses for very serious reasons. Things like drug or alcohol use, as well as accusations of inappropriate contact with patients and sexual misconduct. But very little can actually be done to prevent these people from becoming life coaches. And there's almost nothing that can stop them or anyone else in the field for that matter from engaging in misconduct or questionable practices. Hell, you literally had the director of the DOPL telling ProPublica that when someone calls his office to file a complaint about a life coach, the agency usually has to tell that person there's nothing they can do. Right? Under existing laws, DOPL can't discipline life coaches. The one rule Utah actually has that applies here is one that prevents life coaches from diagnosing clients or developing plans to manage mental health conditions. But again, it's not like these people have a license that can be taken away or suspended. So all the agency can do is cite these coaches for what's called an unauthorized practice. The records viewed by ProPublica showed that the DOPL had only cited 25 people for unauthorized practice in the mental health field in the last decade. And even then, the outlet found that these seldom used citations aren't always effective, and some life coaches have been cited for this multiple times. Like for example, in the very disturbing case of a man by the name of Denham Slade. Right, he had surrendered his therapy license in 2019 after 2 reports that he had engaged in inappropriate conduct with female clients. And so Slade decides, hey, well, I think I'd be a great life coach. And then just 3 months after surrendering his license, he gets cited for unauthorized practice and fined $250 for advertising that he can provide a certain therapy to treat trauma. But, that didn't stop him. But then a year later, he was cited for unauthorized practice again because he kept advertising that he treated a range of mental health issues. Now, notably here, prosecutors do have the power to file charges against life coaches, but they are only allowed to bring criminal charges, meaning that the only time a life coach can actually be held accountable for bad actions is when they commit a full-blown crime. But there is no shortage of questionable or even abusive practices that don't rise to the level of criminal charges, including those prohibited under regulations for therapists. In fact, very few meet that threshold. There have not been any criminal cases brought against a life coach in the last 10 years. So as long as a coach's actions are in that gray area, they can get away with shit they absolutely couldn't do as therapists. And that is where Jody Hildebrandt comes in. Right? Unlike the folks who lost their licenses, Jody actually decided to leave the regulated therapy industry to pursue work in the unregulated world of coaching. With her first starting her self-help company, Connections classroom back in 2012, and there her promotional materials really emphasized the fact that she was a licensed therapist. But a decade later, she scrubbed all references to her credentials from her website and started advertising herself as a life coach. And that's even though she was still licensed as a clinical mental health worker. And a former client by the name of Ethan Preet saying Hildebrandt told him that she made the switch so she wouldn't be limited by rules for therapists. But Ethan also said that she capitalized on that lack of regulation by deploying some very questionable and borderline abusive tactics that she couldn't get away with as a therapist. Right? Ethan started working with Hildebrandt because his now ex-wife wanted them to try her program when their marriage was struggling. So he shelled out a ton of money, spending more than $1,000 a month on Hildebrandt's services. Services like gaslighting and manipulation, with Ethan explaining. I would meet with her every week for almost a year, and it was always like, your wife is going to leave you. If you ever want to see her again, you'll do what I say. And beyond that, Hildebrandt also asked Ethan to cut off contact with his friends and relatives, asked him to live in a tent to humble himself, directed him to live separately from his family, and told him and his wife to stop speaking. And Ethan saying that during this time, Hildebrandt had complete control. But also, Ethan wasn't alone. There are similar stories of abuse from life coaches nationwide. Things like in 2020, a woman in California sued her life coach for convincing her to sign over her home to a nonprofit organization that the coach actually ran. Also last year, a coach in Connecticut was given probation for stealing money from a client with a traumatic brain injury. And just this year, we see things like a life coach in Nevada being sentenced to a year in jail after stealing client money that he was supposed to invest, but instead spent at casinos. But those cases have done very little to move the needle in those states. And previous efforts elsewhere in the country, they've failed. Like one in New Hampshire that would have studied if life coaches should be regulated, and another in Oregon that would have created a voluntary registry. But now you've got many hoping that maybe Utah can change this pattern, especially as lawmakers face pressure to act in the aftermath of the high-profile Frankie-Hildebrandt case. And we're even seeing some lawmakers take steps to make that happen, like with State Senator David Hinkins introducing a bill in the last legislative session, a bill that would require life coaches to register with the DOPL. It would also give the agency the power to define unlawful conduct and revoke a life coach's registration. And very notably here, Hinkins told reporters that he drafted the legislation after the issue was brought to him by Ruby Frankie's ex-husband, Kevin. And Kevin also sending a letter to the state legislature earlier this year urging them to pass the legislation before their session ended. Writing, "My life has been turned upside down. My marriage ended, my family destroyed, and my children tortured because of a dangerous mental health professional who believed she could act outside the ethical bounds of her profession by labeling herself as a life coach." And going on to add that numerous life coaches offer the same services as mental health professionals without the responsibilities of care or liabilities associated with that profession, and arguing that he has encountered many others who have had their lives, finances, and families destroyed because of the actions of a rogue life coach. But despite his best efforts, that bill didn't make it past a first hearing, though lawmakers are expected to continue discussions when they go back in session. So as far as what happens next, we'll have to wait and see, not only in Utah, but also if it spurs similar efforts in other states or even at the national level. But one, I'd love to know your thoughts on this, and two, if you want to contact your congresspeople about this, I got links for you in the description that make it easy.